We are, so I'm gonna do a quick kind of housekeeping stuff. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I always like to just do some quick housekeeping, let everyone know where the restrooms are. So if you head out of this room and go straight down the hallway towards like our little gift shop and the Buffalo Bill painting, kind of our best indicators, go down that hallway and that's where the restrooms are. We also do have a drinking fountain down there if you do need water. Exit, we have an emergency exit over in this corner here, and then obviously just our front exit over there for when you want to leave at the end of the program. So I always like to just let everyone know that if you become a member of the museum, you do get free programs or reduced price, which is just really good to know. And we also have some former programs we've done here on a members only YouTube page, so you can also view some of our former programs if you're a member, so just good to know about member benefits. So my name is Kathleen Eaton. I'm the Visitor Experience and Interpretation Coordinator here, and I'm very glad to welcome Matt Makley here with us this evening. He presented for us last year, and it was so well received that people asked him to come back, and we're very excited to have him again. So he is a professor of history at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and he is the author of 2 books. His most recent, The Small Shall Be Strong, History of Lake Tahoe's Washoe Indians, written in 2018, won an American Library Association's award for Outstanding Academic Title. Born and raised at Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Makley has lived in Golden since 2007. And while his heart is in the canyons and valleys of the Sierra Nevada, he has come to call Colorado and the Rockies home. So we are very glad to have you, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on an inclement weather night. The forecast kept changing on us. It started with 1 to 2 inches, and this morning I had this annoying text alert saying it could be 15 inches. And it's been warm enough. I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem for us getting home tonight, but do be safe getting home. And Kathleen, that was a very generous introduction. I'm not sure if the first talk was so well received that I was invited back, or if I left some questions unanswered. I remember at the end of that talk, which was remote, it was in the depth of the pandemic, the early stages, and I remember at the end, the talk was Colorado water. And one of the members, maybe you're here, I hope you are, one of the members said, that's all great, but what about Clear Creek? And I thought, gee, that's true. I was, should have thought about the audience as making that presentation for this group. We really are interested in this valley and this body of water. So, Kathleen said, well, let's do it again. And I want to thank Kathleen and thank the museum. What a beautiful museum. And congratulations to all of you who are members. I mean, this is just incredible. The artwork in this room is ledger art, which I was not familiar with before tonight, but incredible. Encourage you to take a look if you get a chance. And also I want to compliment the museum on its webpage and some of your digital holdings and collections. Really a nice job curating and presenting. I think that's just such a wonderful community resource, and how fortunate we are to be here in this place so rich in history, so important to the history of not just Colorado, but the American West broadly. And doubly lucky because we're in person. We weren't sure that would be possible, and Kathleen and I have been going back and forth for the better part of a year via email. It's like we've gotten to be friends, we've corresponded so much, and we just kind of thought, let's go for it. We'll think about mid-March in 22, and fingers crossed, we are in person, and here we are. So it's wonderful to be with you tonight. I don't intend to talk for an hour and a half. In fact, I hope I don't talk for an hour. I would prefer to have a conversation. I do want to present some material. My primary field of study is American Indian history, or Native American history, if you like. And I studied at Arizona State University with a man named Peter Iverson. He recently passed away, unfortunately, but just a gracious and wonderful mentor. He worked a lot with the Dene community, or Navajo. He lived at many farms on the reservation and made a point of taking us as his students to the reservation and introducing us to people. And one of the things I noticed right away in my time on the reservation is the importance of water for the Dene. Spent some time in Canyon de Chelly with a Navajo family and watched them hauling buckets of water to get some of their crops the water they needed. and went home and reflected on that. And I knew when I was done with my last book that I wanted to turn my attention to water, and so that's what I've been doing. And I appreciate your indulgence tonight as I kind of work through some of the ideas I've been developing related to water. And of course, it's tied to Clear Creek. So with that, I hope it's not too much false advertising because there's not much Coors in the talk, but I could not resist this Cannonball Creek Coors and Kayaks. It just kind of rolled off the tongue. And obviously, Coors has a massive footprint in the region and nationally, internationally even. A lot of people know of Clear Creek and certainly know of Golden and the Mesas through this beer that has been so incredibly successful. I'm going to start, let's see, there we go. I'm going to start just with a little bit about my home, Lake Tahoe, just to kind of help you understand where my perspective is shaped. Lake Tahoe is an alpine lake. It's one of the deepest in North America, freshwater, natural lake. It's renowned internationally for pristine clarity. Limnologists, the branch of science that studies lakes, has been studying Lake Tahoe since early in the 1950s. University of California, Davis scientists were predominantly those doing the work. And they did what was called a dinner plate test, where they drop a white plate and then they determine how long you can continue seeing the plate as it drops. And in the early tests, they could see the plate 100 feet down. That has declined in the last several decades, and now it's around 70, 75 because of erosion and just the attendant forces of nature that are affected by development around the Tahoe Basin. But this is what drew me to write about Lake Tahoe. Both books, the first was on the sacred side of Lake Tahoe for the Washoe people, and the second was just a broad history of the Washoe people. And learning from them about the value of the lake reinforced what I had learned in graduate school among the Navajo in Canyon de Chelly, that water is at the center of everything for many indigenous communities across the American West and across the world. For the Washoe, the place is Da'oaga, and that was anglicized as Lake Tahoe. You can kind of hear it in the word. The Washoe word is Da'oaga, and that was later shortened to Da'o. And Da'oaga, the phrase means by the edge of the lake. When I was working on the book, I was interviewing lots and lots of Washoe community members, and one of my great sources and friends was this guy, Malin Machado, and he said, water is moving, it's living during the interview. And that's a theme that I continue to find in other places among Native folks, this notion that water is not just something that humans should harness and use. It's something that should be respected because of its own life and its own life force. Here we have Pat McCabe, who happens to be Lakota and Dene, and she had this to say about water. It's alive. Water is life. Not only is it life, but water is also alive. So it has consciousness. The water is listening to us. And that is, I think, sometimes difficult for people to understand. But Malin said the same thing. The full quote I have from Malin on this is that the lake remembers, and that it hears, and that the water itself has memory. And that for me was very difficult to process because it's just not the way I thought about water, and it's something I continue to kind of work with as I push myself to understand water better. So I wanted to start with that to kind of orient the talk, to provide the theme for tonight's talk. And really the theme for tonight's talk is going to be human connection to water and Clear Creek specifically. And we'll see the arc of the talk that humans have been dependent on Clear Creek since the first people arrived in what would become Golden. And that goes back to out of memory, time immemorial, those eras and decades that we don't have written history for, and we have to speculate a fair amount. Certainly water was at the center. A little closer to home here in Colorado, here we have Kenny Frost, who's an important community leader for the Southern Utes. And after the Las Animas spill several years ago, this appeared in the Denver Post. He was giving a cleansing ceremony outside of Durango, and he said, water is life, water is sacred. And so I hope this grounds us a little bit as we proceed, because I'm going to come back to it at the end. I think there's an assumption that we make that is probably not helpful and based on a lot of stereotyping, that Native people all collectively have a better relationship and are environmental stewards. And of course that's not true. I mean, a lot of them are, and there is an ethos among people collectively. But I'm going to argue, or not argue, but suggest tonight that community members right here in Golden have started to have a similar worldview about the water. And if not, fully believing water is alive and conscious, at least understanding that it is at the center of the health of the community, therefore worth protection, worth community cooperation. So with that, we're going to jump in and kind of look at the watershed to orient ourselves. It's a massive watershed, really. It includes a lot of tributaries. The headwaters, of course, begin up near Loveland Pass, surrounded by at least 4 14ers. And so you can imagine that the source for the water is pure. At least it has been in the past, and is to some degree today. And Colorado is considered a headwater state. A lot of fresh water generated here in our state, and of course it flows out of the state. Down the western side of the Continental Divide, Colorado is the major artery that drains the state, and it frustrates a lot of Coloradans that California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming have a share of that water, and California in particular having a significant share of the water. That's a long, complicated story, but yeah.
Could you explain what a watershed is? Or maybe you're getting
Sure. Yeah, the watershed is basically the source itself, so in this case Clear Creek, and then all of the attendant tributaries and the land surrounding it. So with Clear Creek, you can see that the watershed has a number of tributaries, including the North Fork of Clear Creek, which runs through Black Hawk and Central City, which we're going to be talking about a lot tonight. And then the creek ultimately goes down into what is considered the lower part of the watershed, where it opens up into a broad floodplain and has seen less significant human activity, but still quite a bit in the form of dredging in the early 1900s to get to those minerals that people were after. So it ultimately gives its water to the South Platte as it runs out east. And I want to kind of think about people who have had a relationship with Clear Creek before the Europeans, before Euro-American arrival. And so if we look at this map, this is demonstrating the spread of the people who would become the Shoshone, the Paiutes, and the Utes. They share a language base, and so it's quite possible, quite likely, that they were one people at one time who migrated from the southern, south of what is today the border with the United States and Mexico, from the deserts of northern New Mexico into the southwestern United States, and then split up. Why were they migrating? They were probably following food sources. We know that the pinyon pine tree spread north about 4,000 years ago, and it's likely that they were part of that migration as well. When they separated, they became distinct peoples, the Shoshones, the southern Paiutes, the northern Paiutes, and of course the Utes. And it is the Utes who have the longest, clearest historical association with Colorado. This is a map of the Ute bands, and you can see that the easternmost Moach band is typically associated with the Front Range. But there is some debate over just how actively they occupied the Front Range. This is another map which demonstrates the expanse of the Comanche. These are bands of Comanche. And you can see if you go up north, the Yamparikas, which were a band of Comanche living on the Arkansas River, had pretty significant presence just south and east of Denver. And this map doesn't clearly indicate, whether or not the Utes were actively living in the Front Range year-round. I think there's a good chance they were. If you talk to Utes, though, they absolutely will tell you, yes, our people had our camps there, certainly. But we also have to account for, oops, sorry, I skipped one. We have to account for the arrival of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in what would become Colorado as well. Cheyenne and Arapaho are a little bit more recent in the historical record. They arrived maybe in the late 1700s, perhaps slightly earlier, mid 1700s. They speak a form of the Algonquian language, and it is quite likely that they were coming from the upper Mississippi around Minnesota, and that they were probably part of a series of migrations that had to do with competition over resources as they became more scarce in that region due to really significant European colonial activity, French, British, later American. But so what that means is when you land here on the Front Range, you have competing interests. The oldest records we have for human occupation go back about 10,000 years. People called the Folsom. That's not the name that people had for themselves, it's just a name reflecting artifacts and where they were found that are indicative of this culture. And they were using valleys like Clear Creek, canyons like Clear Creek, and water sources like Clear Creek. We don't know exactly how. Same thing with the historic associations, the Utes, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. We haven't been great, by we I mean non-native scholars, we haven't been great at getting that information, and maybe communities aren't eager to share that information, especially with non-native scholars who they see as potentially colonizing them intellectually, furthering the colonial enterprise. And so unfortunately, we can't say with total certainty who was using Clear Creek and how. We can speculate when we go back to this map and we think about other groups like the Paiute. We know that Paiutes who were living near the Owens River Valley in just the southern Nevada, close to the California borderlands, and actually over the border, they were actually irrigating. They were drawing water from the Owens River and channeling it in irrigation paths to get water to their most important medicinal and edible crops. Is it possible that Utes or Cheyennes or Arapahoes were doing that here in Golden? It is possible, but I haven't seen anything from archaeologists or from the oral tradition that would prove that. Not that it didn't happen, right? The absence of evidence isn't evidence of the absence, right? It's the saying in the archaeological world. Anyway, as Europeans and Euro-Americans begin to arrive in this land, there is this perception of the place as being a wasteland. And that really takes root in the early 19th century, 1806, with the expedition of Pike, Zebulon Pike, for whom Pike's Peak is named. Pike didn't have much good to say about the Front Range. It's a desert wasteland, it's arid, it's not going to really serve American interests. He would be followed 14 years later by Stephen Long, or 13 years later, Stephen Long, the Long expedition. And Long was even more explicit in his recordings. He said, this place is actually going to be a barrier to the expansion of civilization. It's a desert wasteland. It's really not suitable for human habitation. It's barren, it's treeless, so on and so forth. Not a wild endorsement of the area that would become Denver and Golden. But it set this kind of American cultural understanding of the place. Nothing of particular value here. It was during Long's expedition that a couple of French trappers who were accompanying him gave the name Cannonball Creek to what would become later Vasquez Creek and then of course Clear Creek. And the reason they called it Cannonball Creek reportedly is because the stones that they saw in the creek were shaped roughly like cannonballs. But they also, and Long as well, commented on how difficult this country was to travel in, particularly the canyon and the creek, not navigable. Of course, people knew that gold existed in the mountains. The California gold rush began in 1848, and people have been looking for gold in the Rockies long before that. And they knew it was there, they just didn't know where exactly. And after the gold rush in California, the search picked up in earnest. And it would be a guy from Georgia, William Green Russell, who is credited with finding the first significant gold that set off the Colorado gold rush. One of his partners in this search in the summer of '58 was writing in his memories about this expedition, and he had this to say about Clear Creek Canyon. Because they figured out they weren't finding much indication of gold in Cherry Creek and the South Platte, and they knew if you go up in those canyons, Boulder Creek, Clear Creek, you probably have a better chance of getting to the gold that's undoubtedly there. And so Russell and Dickinson, his partner here, they set off into the canyon, and here's what he remembered about it. He was writing about it later, so this wasn't an on-the-ground journal. This was his memory, and of course, you have to account for that. You know, our memories are flawed, and certainly there's probably some bias and just forgetfulness there. But this is what he said. We attempted to go to the mountains by following up Clear Creek. We left our main camp at the foot of the mountains where Golden City now is, and tried to make our way up Clear Creek. The party on foot being advanced while I was trying to climb along the side of the mountains with my pack animals, which is pretty remarkable when you think about the canyon, climbing along the side of the canyon with pack animals and supplies. The man on foot had not gone over a mile when they called to me to turn back as they could not go farther, saying, a bird could not fly up that canyon. I like that. Well, other people are going to try, and they're going to encounter the same thing, especially after gold. Gold was discovered in the summer of '58, and very quickly after that, thousands and thousands of people are going to pour into what was at that time Kansas territory. And they're going to bring with them this exuberance that came to be defined as a fever, this very real malady that doctors were seeing and treating called gold fever. And you know, there is conversations about, was that a real illness? Was it from working with potentially toxic metals as they were, you know, trying to leach the precious metal from the ore from the earth? Or was it just a psychological ailment? You know, going back in the Spanish records, you find both Columbus, Christopher Columbus, and Hernan Cortez, the guy who's responsible for quote unquote toppling the Aztec Empire in 1521, both of them talk about this ailment of gold fever. So there is a long history of that. It wasn't unique to Americans in the 19th century. Anyway, news gets out, people flood the area, including this guy Larimer, right? And he brings his brother, and they set up a shop down at the Cherry Creek and South Platte confluence, and the race is on. Who's going to build the city that sticks and becomes the capital? People were just sure that this was going to be the next gold rush. It all made sense. You had the mountains, you had the placer level deposits. So people are rushing to the area. Well, what does that mean for the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Utes? It means that they're going to have to, you know, eventually give way to the rush of people. And it is a very painful and difficult chapter in Colorado history. The Cheyenne and Arapaho actually had a treaty, 1851 Treaty of Fort Weiss. The original treaty had granted all of this land that you see between the North Platte and roughly down to Bent's Fort and the Arkansas. Of course, once gold was discovered in 1858, the federal government had to renegotiate that treaty. And when they did, they moved Arapaho and Cheyenne down to a much smaller reservation on the Arkansas River, and of course adjacent to the Sand Creek, where ultimately the terrible massacre ensued. Today there is no Cheyenne Arapaho reservation. They've been fully removed from the state, and that's obviously, you know, a very difficult chapter in Colorado's history. From the American perspective, you know, this is what they're after. Today we know that there's a very significant deposit of precious metals that runs roughly north, south, easterly, starting down in the San Juans and a little bit south, all the way up to, you know, Gold Hill, and of course Idaho Springs, Central City, Black Hawk. They are at the center of the mineral belt, and this is where the really early, intense gold prospecting is going to take place, and that means a whole lot for water. In the watershed, we know that George Jackson found some placer level deposits on Chicago Creek, and he was very quiet about that. He didn't want anyone to know. I'm going to read actually from my prepared notes here. Historian Dwayne Smith, who is obviously one of the most prolific and talented historians of Colorado, had this to say about Jackson and this find. Jackson kept his mouth tight as a, quote, #2 beaver trap. There's a historical marker here in town which says Jackson had told his secret to only one other person. Who was it?
Tom Golden.
Beaver. Tom Golden. He told young Tom Golden, whose mouth was reportedly, quote, as tight as a #4 beaver trap. No matter the number of the trap or whose lips were tighter, the point is that word didn't get out right away because Jackson wanted it that way. Jackson actually had some difficulties with his health after he had been trapped in a flash flood, and he didn't end up, well, he didn't stay that long, but his relationship with Golden was important. He really liked Tom and respected him, and I think young Tom Golden nursed him back to health after he was trapped in that flash flood. And though Golden himself didn't stay here long, his surpassing qualities resulted in the naming of our town for him. A little bit later, and notice the date here, January 59. I mean, they're going up Chicago Creek in January. People were, that's that gold fever. People were absolutely intent on getting to the diggings before anyone else, and then like Jackson, finding what they could find and then keeping it to themselves. The next guy, John Gregory, he was actually a miner with a lot of experience. And he is going to start looking for gold up around what would become Blackhawk. And in March, he had a significant discovery, but it didn't quite garner all that much attention. And he went back in May and then found indications of lode gold, which placer gold is that gold that exists on the surface. It's been worked free from the deep veins, and it's easier to collect. Indications of lode gold are to an experienced miner like Gregory, you know that there is more, and that you're really close to the vein that exists deep within the earth, and that this is now going to become an opportunity to go down to that. Or different type of mining, hydraulic mining, where you essentially just wash the mountainside away. That definitely happened in the Clear Creek watershed. That creates all kinds of ecological disasters. But the more pronounced method that took hold, and it was developed in California and then refined in Virginia City, Nevada, following the Comstock lode, the silver rush in 1858, was tunneling into the earth, the hard rock mining. And to do that, you have to use massive timbers. And they perfected this technique in the mines of the Comstock, square sets. And it's 4x4 timbers, which are set in squares, and they set about 2 feet apart, and you use that to brace the earth as you tunnel down into the earth to get to the lode gold. And that's what's going to take hold up in the diggings. I want to talk a little bit about how people are going to try to get to the diggings, because we just saw a bird can't even fly up Clear Creek. How are you going to get up to those diggings? Were people going around? Here we have Albert Richardson commenting on, he was traveling with Horace Greeley, the editor from New York, who is one of the big money guys behind Union Colony, which is today Greeley. He and Greeley are traveling near Golden, and they try to make the ascent up Clear Creek. And Richardson says, we found Clear Creek greatly swollen, so we left our coach, saddled the mules, and rode them through the stream amid a crowd of immigrants who sent up 3 hearty cheers for Horace Greeley. Greeley was already famous, he's a New York editor. The road was swarming with travelers. In the distance, and this is May of '59, so it shows you how fast it happens. People are now clustering around Golden and the Clear Creek Canyon. Swarming with travelers. In the distance, they were clambering right up a hill as abrupt as the roof of a cabin. This road, only 5 weeks old, was beaten like a turnpike, and far above toiled men, mules, and cattle. Wagons carrying less than half a ton were drawn by 20 oxen. I gather you wouldn't need 20 oxen generally to carry half a ton. That's a big deal, right? He said, drawn by 20 oxen. While those descending, and this is interesting, dragged huge trees in full leaf and branch behind them as brakes. eventually, there's going to be a desire to build a railroad. And Golden and town promoters like Loveland, they decide this is a really good idea because we want to make sure Golden is competitive and we can outpace our competitors in Denver. And so quickly plans emerged to build this Colorado Central Railroad, which works really hard to shove Clear Creek to one side of the canyon and lay track. But it was perilous work, difficult work that took several years to complete and was just a little bit too slow in terms of competing fully with Denver to get access up to the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going in just north in Wyoming. But this is going to be the start of that intense travel into Clear Creek, giving access, and today, of course, the road up Six Canyon is built on top of the former railroad. A lot of the tunnels that were blasted through, right, were for the original railroad. Up in the diggings, you can see that a lot of activity is going to be centered around where Gregory originally found his deposits. You can see the Gregory mine up here, and here sits Central City, here sits Blackhawk, and this begins to bustle with people and activity. And very quickly, it becomes, Blackhawk came to be called the land of the mills. And the reason you need mills when you're processing precious metals like gold is because you need to somehow separate the gold from the earth. It's not a perfect process. And the mills had to be water driven. And so that is going to tie up a lot of the water on Clear Creek. When you look at historic photos, this one coming from 1900, you can see just adjacent to the creek, all of these waste piles. Those are going to be big trouble for Clear Creek in the not too distant future after this photo is taken, but we're not quite there yet. Here we have some mining activity in Blackhawk, and you notice that you have the sluice. They're working a sluice here to separate the earth and the gold, a very early mechanism for getting to the gold. Not terribly effective and not yielding large results, and so it was ultimately done away with, or at least set to the side as the hard rock mining took hold. Notice the hills behind Blackhawk here. Eventually they're just almost totally denuded. That's one of the things I always pay attention to in historic photos. Well, where are the trees? And I just this weekend, getting ready for this talk, I drove from Netherland down to Blackhawk in Central City and was just re-familiarizing myself with the area. And you see the forests are back, right? But those are second generation forests, and that's why they're so small, those pine. And it is remarkable that they're back like they are. Gregory Gulch, you can see here, historic photo, and notice how vertical it is. Notice as well all of this waste that's piling up, and something's got to be done with the tailings and the mining waste as it mounts. We're going to now turn our attention, we're moving into the second part of the talk here, where we really get into a little bit of Colorado water law. Not enough to hopefully bore us to tears or confuse us to frustration, but just enough to help us, and many of you probably already are familiar with this. And I should have started by saying thank you for letting me, as someone from, should I say it out loud, California. But Tahoe is bisected by the state line of California and Nevada, and I was very close to the Nevada border. But thank you for letting me give my interpretation of this history, which is certainly not perfect, and it's not that of someone who has lived here and been a resident, and obviously there are very talented historians of gold and much more qualified than myself to talk about this. So I do thank you and appreciate your time as I give you my kind of interpretation. But we're going to move into water here a little bit. So what happens in the diggings is people need water. You need water to wash the sand. You need water to power eventually your mill, to turn the wheel that will drive the mechanism of your mill. You need water for domestic purposes, for cooking, for drinking, for bathing, for all of the things we know you need water for. And so very quickly, some regulations started to pop up. Now, this is before territorial law is in place. This is certainly before the Colorado Constitution and before state law will dictate how water is managed. And what you find is a practice that really was popular around the West, which is whoever gets the water first has the priority right. And you have to, in the West, that is critical because there's not enough water. In the east of the Mississippi, there's enough rain and enough surface water. You know, I was talking to one of my students, Joe, who is a really great guy, and he's from Florida, and he's like, yeah, in Florida we've got too much water. Our problem is, what do you do with all the water? Where do you pump it, right? Not here. And very early on, it was clear, you know, whoever has the water has the power or the access to power. And so the provision that I want to point to is the 8th out of the Gregory Diggings Regulations, and it was this: it is resolved that in all cases, priority of claims when honestly carried out shall be respected. That's basically saying, if someone can prove that they had a claim on Clear Creek, then we have to respect that. And how do you keep track of that? I mean, this is going to get really dicey. But the interesting thing for us is, and here I submit to you that Clear Creek and the diggings and the early Colorado gold rush on Clear Creek and the Clear Creek watershed is fundamental in the development of Western water law, not just Colorado water law, Western water law. And we'll see that again when we get to kayaks. Very unique dealing with water in Golden that sets a model for the rest of the West. Yeah?
Was this voted upon, or how did this become
That's
law?
a good question. That's a really good question. To be honest, I don't know. But let me speculate. Always dangerous. Yeah, I think there was probably community meetings and probably a consensus vote at some point. But that's a really good question.
I imagine the wealthy and people of this favor potentially.
Well, that's the thing with the mining is early on you get the Jacksons and the Gregorys and the folks who are able to kind of try and carve some wealth out of this. But very quickly, you know, other people realize like the industry is going to arrive. The people with the deep pockets and the corporations, they'll take over the mining, and so then very enterprising people turned to what's called mining the miners, setting up shop and selling to the miners. Wall is a good example of that in Golden, who we'll talk about a little bit. You know, he saw that there's an opportunity to set up agricultural enterprise and sell the fresh foods that the miners are going to need. Probably the best example is Levi Strauss, the miner who was in the California diggings and had brought a bunch of canvas with him, and once he busted and couldn't find any gold, he was so poor he had to cut his own pants out of the canvas he brought for his dwelling. And as he was wearing those canvas pants around the diggings, people were like, I want some pants of Levi's. You know? Levi's. Okay. So this gives rise to our uniquely Western water law known as prior appropriation. And the simplest way to remember this is first in time is first in right. It's in this very small text here. He who is first in time is first in right. And what that means is it's slightly counterintuitive, because if you look at this diagram and you see the person who goes upstream, you think, well, certainly they've got a right to the water because they're up here, and their right is probably more significant than this person down here because they're lower in the watershed. The reality is, if this person had theirs first, they get that senior right. And Denver was really good at appropriating water rights, and that's why we have rights to a lot of the western waterways that would have gone into the Colorado River, and of course, much to the frustration of our western neighbors who wonder why Denver even exists. Okay, let me give you one more kind of quick reinforcing example for prior appropriation. It happened a little bit north of us on the St. Vrain, and there was a man living up there who was a Civil War veteran, Reuben Coffin. He had established a farm for himself after the Civil War, and he had fought on the Union side, and by all accounts was acquitted honorably in the Great War, and wanted to retire peacefully as a farmer in this beautiful place on the St. Vrain. And there came some really dry months in the summer of 1879. And Coffin was like, why am I not getting the water I normally get on my farm? And so he and his brother set off upstream, and they find out that a little ways up from his property, this group had built a dam, and they were actually diverting water out of the South Fork of the St. Vrain, which ultimately pours into the North Fork, so it was affecting his water interests. And they were diverting that water via an irrigation canal down into James Creek, and then ultimately into Left Hand Creek, and Coffin was understandably upset. And he and his brother were under the impression that because their property was adjacent to and including parts of the river itself, they had protected rights that needed to be honored. And so, well, the first thing they did, they dynamited the dam. And of course, the owners of that dam, the left-hand ditch company, were not particularly happy about that. And this is gonna end up in the courts. And the original court, I think it was a district court in Boulder, said, boy, you know, Reuben, good case, you know, poor guy. Yeah, Reuben's entitled to his water. Left hand is going to appeal that to the Colorado Supreme Court, where that decision will be reversed. The Chief Justice at the time, Albert, he said, we've always recognized the priority of prior appropriations since the date of the earliest appropriations of water within the boundaries of the state. So you know he went back to those regulations set up in the date. And he's saying, you know, we've got to honor this practice of prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. Left-hand ditch company had accessed that water on the South Fork of the St. Vrain before Coffin, and they could prove it. Coffin's case was ruled against him, and ultimately they were allowed to keep their dam and keep the flow that they were entitled to for their enterprise. That establishes what comes to be called the Colorado Doctrine. It's really important because that's what's going to allow cities like Golden, municipalities, to claim water rights in the 21st century for things like kayaking. And it is, you know, obviously something that becomes very controversial. People think, why are you going to protect water for recreation when we need it for farming, when we need it for municipal use? And that, of course, comes down to community values and just a host of factors. So, what we know is going to happen, or what did happen, is that the mining muddied up Clear Creek really quickly because you have all of that waste, and there's really no outlet for it other than the creek itself. And we're not just talking about mining waste now, we're talking about, you know, household waste as well. People were simply throwing their garbage in the creek, and, you know, what's the old saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. It doesn't really work that way. We threw a bunch of radioactive material in steel drums in San Francisco Bay, and now we're like, oops, those are starting to leak. And in the case of Clear Creek and the South Platte for that matter, you start to see disease clusters. People are suffering from these waterborne illnesses because you've got a lot of waste in your drinking water. Today, you know, it seems commonsensical to us, like, oh no, you gotta keep your water sources clean. But you know, footloose and fancy out on the western frontier in the early heady days of the gold rush, you just probably weren't thinking about that. You were after your money or your gold and trying to live. So we know that Clear Creek began to be impacted negatively as early as 1860. Here we have something coming out of the Western Mountaineer, which was a short-lived Golden City newspaper, and they're talking about the establishment of agriculture in the Golden area. And they said by 1860, so just a year after the initial kind of craze in the Clear Creek upper country, Black Hawk and Central City, they identified 6 farms on Clear Creek south of Golden City itself. The Baugh brothers had 600 acres, and then Judge Boyd and his sons 200 acres, and there were several others also listed in this newspaper article. Oops, I left an L off Wall's last name here. David King Wall had already started farming. He was one of the earliest, at least one of the earliest recorded in Golden history. However, the waste from the minings were starting to take a horrible toll. And an interesting window into that comes to us from Nicolay, who happened to be one of 2 personal secretaries to Lincoln. And in 1863, Nicolay had negotiated treaties up in the Minnesota country with some native communities, and so needing a break in '63, probably from the Civil War and this really exhausting work schedule with Lincoln, he set out west to Colorado, ostensibly to help negotiate a treaty with the Utes, but also as a regenerative kind of vacation. And he liked to travel, he liked to experience new places, and he kept wonderful, he wrote letters to his wife. I have some of them here. And in these letters, we have this wonderful window into Golden City at the time. And here we have an excerpt from a letter where he says, quote, "A little village having an ambitious name of Golden City. Right? There is a dashing little stream called Clear Creek, and it's as muddy as the Missouri, with dirt and refuse of the mills whose wheels it has turned to pulverize gold ore. So here you have Lincoln's personal secretary getting his first look at Golden and Clear Creek, and he's like, that's not a Clear Creek. It's as muddy as the Missouri, and it's terribly tainted. Let's see, I was gonna read a little bit from another letter. This one is about the diggings, because ultimately he stays in Denver for a couple days. He's not impressed with Denver. And then he's going to go up to the diggings, because he wants to get to the heart of where all the action is. And when he gets there, he's writing his wife. This was August 23rd, 1863. We are here in this famous Gregory diggings, which first gave the Colorado mines their reputation, and which have now grown into an enterprising mountain town of pine forest houses and shanties built along one or two narrow streets in the gulch and its various branches. Or rather, I would say there are 4 towns, for each, aspires to be a metropolis, and within a radius of 3 or 4 miles, contain a population of several, perhaps 10,000 people. So Golden itself is a sleepy little aspiring town, but the diggings, Central City and Blackhawk, are bustling. Now, this is coming to us from a farmer who was interviewed in the mid-20th century, and he had this to say. In 1882, when I first saw Clark Creek, I thought its name was a misnomer. I thought it should have been called Muddy Creek instead of Clear Creek. The water had a dull, gray-blue, milky appearance caused by the dumping of mine tailings into the stream from mines located in Gilpin and Clear Creek counties. I thought it a shame that such a muddy and unwholesome-looking stream should be permitted to flow down the beautiful Clear Creek Valley. The waters were so polluted that fish could not live in the stream. Horses and other livestock could not drink the waters safely on account of the poisonous substances coming from the mines into the stream. The water was unfit for irrigation or domestic purposes, and much of the irrigated lands were damaged by use of the water. Mud, sand, and silt flowed through the irrigation ditches to such an extent as to cause irreparable injury to the land in many places. He went on in his remembering to say, a group of us got together and tried to raise enough money to sue and stop the pollution, and he said they were just out, they couldn't compete. The $1,500 they rounded up wasn't going to get the job done. And so he continued to kind of lament in his memory about this, like, for us farmers, and Wheat Ridge, of course, its name comes from its ability to grow wheat very successfully because of the sandy kind of soil that was very good for production. One of the biggest sources of the pollution is coming from a tunnel that was built to drain some of the mines north of Blackhawk. And it ended up, once it was completed, it ended up draining over 200 mines. And so all of the waste in the mines was being collected into a tunnel, and then this tunnel was taking the waste to Idaho Springs and putting it in Clear Creek. So it was a really concentrated deposit of toxic acid water that was essentially killing all aquatic life. Many of you might remember when Clear Creek was not swimmable or kayakable, and certainly not fishable because the trout populations had been decimated. Fast forward now, so this is a quick fast forward, 1983. This newly formed agency, who many people were suspicious of, and perhaps rightfully so, the Environmental Protection Agency, came around and said, wow, you've got quite a mess on your hands there in the Clear Creek watershed. And locals agreed. Locals said, yeah, we do. We're not sure we need you Washington folks to tell us how to take care of it, but we agree there's a problem. Well, the EPA declared this 400 square mile region of Clear Creek watershed a massive Superfund site. One of the most significant Superfund sites, and they found all kinds of problems with the water, particularly when you consider that, thousands of people are dependent on it for drinking and domestic purposes. And so it is really a sad moment in the history of Clear Creek, although sad but also helpful and hopeful, because you have outside recognition that this is going to need to be rehabilitated. And this is where we start to transition to the end of the talk, where I really want to make the case for community involvement in water. One of the things that we talk about in the water class I'm teaching right now at MSU Denver, and I'm very happy to have two of my students here tonight. One of the things we've been talking about is the degree to which water in the West is managed by the federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation. We have this very strong, and I think, as a multi-generational Westerner, my family goes back both sides, mom, Bay Area, Oakland, dad, San Diego. My family still knows where the ranch is at the junction of 5 and 8 near Mesa or San Diego State University, where my great-great-grandfather had a ranch. And as a Westerner, I've spent a lot of time in mining communities, farming communities, and I know how proud we are as a people and how proud we are of our independence. And there is this ethic that is really admirable about what it means to be a Westerner. We can be rugged individualists, right? And John Wesley Powell, one of the first people to really philosophize about how life is going to take shape in the West, the one-armed Civil War veteran who mapped the Colorado River. Before it was known to Euro-Americans, he made this daring journey twice down the Colorado River. And when he was done, the federal government hired him to survey Western lands and give them some sense for what the government was facing in these newly acquired lands. And he produced what came to be called his report on the arid lands of the West. When this report came out, people were kind of disappointed, because instead of a really nice advertisement for boosterism in the West, John Wesley Powell was quite circumspect, and he said, there's not enough water in the West to do what people are thinking they should do. And in fact, we should probably leave the watersheds to the people who live there. And in his mind, he laid forth a plan that he called this watershed management plan, where he said the people, the communities, should be responsible for building the infrastructure, building the dams, building the diversion canals, and caring for the water. Well, it was not that different from what the earlier Hispanic populations had been doing on Western waters. They had a system called the Ezekiel System, which when I did the talk about a year ago for this community, I talked about the Ezekiel System. That's a system that goes back all the way to the ancient world. It's a product, literally, of Latin traditions through the Romans, Hispanic traditions through the Spanish, Islamic traditions through the Caliphate that spread into the Iberian Peninsula in the 700s and held the Iberian Peninsula, and all of their water technology combined to form this system that became the Ezekiel System. Ezekiel is actually an Arabic term in origin, and it actually comes from Yemen, from an indigenous people in Yemen, and it means water carrier or water bearer. And that system was brought with the Spanish to North America, and particularly the Rio Grande country, and then up into southern and southwestern Colorado. There was a massive land grant down there in 1844 called the Sangre de Cristo land grant, and families were drawn to the valley on the upper Rio Grande, and they implemented this practice of community management and ownership of the water, known as the Ezekiel System. That system was codified in New Mexican law, and actually elements of it still exist today in Colorado. There are shadows of it subtextually, I think, in our laws, but it's still in practice on the ground, because there are still families in the San Juans, near the San Juans, who are practicing that Ezekiel system of water management. And I think when we're approaching, what's happening in Clear Creek, what I like about, and here I'm editorializing, so just take it for what it's worth, but what I like about this history is now we've come to the 20th century, the 1980s, and instead of just more, destruction and chaos and waste, there's certainly still a lot of that, but there is this recognition that we have to care for water. And to me, that's a welcome transition. When we, as and we, I'm collectively speaking of Europeans and Euro-Americans who have colonized and arrived in North America. And the first stage of our arrival was often characterized by violent encounters with indigenous people. In terms of first world nations, we're actually pretty good about being able to acknowledge that publicly. There are some nations where you don't talk about what happened to indigenous people. You just, Russia. What about those indigenous people who were, so vivid and occupying so much of that landscape? Well, maybe I'm being unfair to Russia just because it's in the news all the time right now, but in the United States, yeah.
I have a question.
Sure, yeah.
So when you say the caring for water is new to the 20th century and that's an important step for Colorado and just environmentalism, don't you think that could also be part of kind of the nexus between boosterism and environmentalism? So like the draw
Yes.
to bring people to
Absolutely.
Colorado is that we care?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's become part of our identity, right? And I should be careful so I don't suggest that it's just environmentalists. Because when you look at the coalitions who are working to keep Clear Creek clean, you find representatives from Coors, you find representatives from mining companies, you find representatives from recreational industries, you find representatives from municipalities. And that seems to be, and again, this is an outsider with an imperfect view certainly, but there seems to be growing momentum for each of the water districts in Colorado for that kind of collective work. And in the Southwest, you see a lot of input from Southern Utes. And the water conferences involve Southern Utes all the time. Many of the conferences I've been involved in the last year often start with something from a member of the Southern Ute community or the Mountain Ute community, which I think is really important. We're trying to come to terms with that past, and until we do, I just don't think we fully know who we are as a society. There's a big spot in our rearview mirror that is not visible to us. And it is painful, and sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, and that's okay, because the discomfort we feel talking about it is nothing compared to the people who live through it. And it's one of the great hallmarks of a free society, the ability to critically reflect on one's past. You're living in tyranny when you can't critically reflect on your past, when you're censored. I have a colleague who happens to be Chinese American, Dr. Tien, and he told me, he still writes textbooks that are published in China. He said they will just take entire sections out. If he had something on Tiananmen Square, no, he wouldn't even do it because it'll never make it past the censor. And so that's something we talk about in our classes at MSU. Like, wow, we have this freedom. That's a big responsibility. And what I'm seeing as we're interpreting this history, and Clear Creek is a wonderful case study for us, is this really important watershed at the center of Colorado history, the center of the early Colorado gold rush, completely devastated by mining. And I wouldn't suggest it was just this, naked aggression, it was a capitalist drive to profit, but in the context of the time, it made perfect sense to the people doing it. And then we are left as inheritors of that to kind of go through and see, well, what of value do we bring with us, and what do we need to address in terms of sustainability? And I think that's where we are. We've gotten to this point where we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves if that water is constantly carrying toxic metals, toxic wastes that are going to poison our crops, poison our children, poison our water supplies. And so while this was a painful step in 1983, because locals definitely bristled at the arrival of the EPA, no one wants to see, well, maybe not no one, but a lot of people don't want to see Washington bureaucrats, probably in suits with clipboards. It kind of scares us. But they developed this coalition of people who cared. And eventually that translated into really significant work and development, like the creation of this water treatment plant above Blackhawk, which is now pulling metal out of the water daily. And I think it's this treatment plant that is actually taking the metals it's pulling out of the water and compressing it and selling it, putting it on the market. So there is an opportunity to kind of create economic benefits from the cleaning. So we're seeing cooperation today from groups like the Clear Creek Watershed Forum. Any members here? Established, I believe, in 1990. Later, the forum became a nonprofit foundation, and that foundation has been at the forefront of gathering information, presenting, I mean, really brilliant information. And as I was preparing this talk, I leaned on the foundation reports really hard, and I just congratulate them on incredible work. They earned a grant from the EPA in the early 2000s, I believe, or maybe the mid to early 2000s, and they used that to create a sustainability report for the Clear Creek watershed that is now becoming an example for other watersheds across the country. So much to like about Clear Creek Watershed Forum, but you also have the Upper Clear Creek Watershed Association, which is officially recognized as a governing kind of structure in the state of Colorado. Upper Clear Creek Watershed Advisory Group made up of community members. Then you have the feds, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the state entity that is coordinating on the ground is the Colorado Department of Public Health. And there are, of course, heroes in each of these entities from my perspective, people who are every day rolling up their sleeves, getting in the creek, measuring flow, measuring toxicity, and helping us understand what the future might hold for this waterway. This is a snapshot of the cover of a recent, 2007 Watershed Report, easily accessible online. If you're interested, just Google Clear Creek Watershed Report. This will come up. It's like 100 pages. It's got lots of graphs and lots of images, and is really helpful. Okay, let's finish now, and I promise I'm almost finished. Check the time here.
7:06.
Okay, yeah, sorry, a little longer than I wanted to. Many people, myself included, when you first arrive in Golden, you're like, if it's the summer months, wow, what is that? That's so cool. You've got all these people, and if you're there early, it's these really skilled kayakers, and then you get there a little later in the afternoon, it's all these people with tubes, and it's high schoolers, and it's such a wonderful community space, although sometimes I feel like locals might feel like it's a little bit over impacted, and I probably wouldn't blame you, but being from Tahoe, you have my sympathy. It is a double-edged sword, right? Tourism. People like it for the economic value, but my mom still lives in Tahoe, and she's now fairly old, and a lot of the time we're just talking, and a lot of the time she's complaining about tourists at Tahoe. But when I first got to Golden, I was like, that is so cool. Probably because I was coming from Tempe, where when we moved to Tempe, we moved in August, and I didn't know it. Our water heater, the pilot light, was not lit, and for 2 weeks, no one noticed. We were showering. So we got here, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's like natural water, snow melt from the mountain, and then these kayakers, and not just kayakers, but this kayak course. And then I come to find out, like, yeah, it's actually a whitewater park that was developed specifically to attract competitions and participants from around not just the country, but the world. And it's such a cool thing. Golden was one of the first municipalities in Colorado in the Front Range to do this. Fort Collins was a little bit earlier, I think, on the Pooter. And actually, what happened in Fort Collins set the legal foundation for what would play out here in Golden. So Golden builds this whitewater park in '98, starts attracting lots of people to the park, and then decides to use some of their senior appropriative rights based on prior appropriation to claim more water and to say we need that water because we need to keep boats floating, and not just boats floating, but we also need to make sure there's enough water for the aquatic wildlife, the fish and the birds, and so this is something that's good for everyone. Well, Colorado up to that point had recognized legally the ability of watersheds and communities to protect in-stream flows, so you're not diverting water now, but protecting the water as it stays in the riverbed or the creek bed for environmental purposes, not for recreation. And so when Golden went forward to the district court, the way water is adjudicated in Colorado, there's 7 water courts, and they're carved into districts. And when Golden went to the district court, the district water court, they said, we want 1,000 cubic feet per second during the high summer months to guarantee that our boats can float in Clear Creek. And immediately, Coors, Westminster, North Glen, a dozen litigants came and said, no, we totally object. Well, Golden did a good job. meeting and arbitrating and getting to the table and saying, hey, look, this is good for us, it's good for our economy, and here's why it can be good for you too, and it's gonna be nice clean water we send down the river when we're done with it. And eventually, it was down to just one primary litigant. It was the state engineer's office and the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And the Colorado Water Conservation Board, it's kind of complicated why they were opposed, but they, prior to all this happening, had the principal right to establish in-stream flow protections. And so this was kind of a challenge to their autonomy in that arena. And so they are objecting to this. They're like, no, we don't want this. And so the district court, the water court, rules in favor of Golden. Yeah, this is all good. Their claim is good. We're going to make this decree, and Golden gets the water that it needs for this part. Well, Colorado Water Conservation Board was not satisfied with that ruling, so they took it to the Supreme Court. Colorado Supreme Court split 3-3. Justice Hobbs, who passed away recently, a brilliant giant of an intellect in the field of Colorado water, recused himself, which led to the 3-3 ruling. I don't know why he recused himself. I will find out. But 3-3, and that means if it's a split vote, it goes back to the earlier ruling, stands as decreed, they get the water. That was news that all over the country. This is a New York Times headline from July. Colorado struggles to define how recreational water is going to be used. As soon as this ruling comes in, this is the actual brief from the case with the decree, which is available online, full text, you can read through it. It's really interesting. Here I've just given some of the details. Filing for 1,000 cubic feet per second. District court finds in favor of Golden. And what they are working to protect are called RICDs, recreational in-channel diversions. That's a phrase that was not very common before 2000, but the legislature is going to pick up on this and be like, oh, okay, we see what's happening. They passed a law in 2001 that makes many people happy and some people mad, that basically recognizes the right of these RICDs in the world of water law. That ruling is later, or that legislative piece is later refined in another legislative action. But the bottom line is this. Golden gets its whitewater park with the water protected, and other municipalities start to line up to do the same thing. And I think as of fairly recently, there are either 13 or so, maybe slightly more, of these decrees from the water courts that have given the RICDs to municipalities like Golden, like Gunnison, like Fort Collins. Finishing up here, what does water mean to each of us on a daily basis? I challenge my students, I challenge my kids. When you turn on that water, where does it come from? It works so hard for us. Clear Creek, no better example of a hard-working entity. I look at it with awe and respect today. Think about what it's done for Colorado, the billions of dollars that is generated, not just in mining, but today with kayaking and recreation, tourist dollars. That's jobs, that's community. And people are happy. They're interfacing with the water. They may not think of it as they're tubing with beers, like, oh my gosh, I'm interfacing with water. But it makes you happy, being in water, right? When we were kids, didn't we? I mean, we like it. You get in the water and you hear the splashing, and if I can't sleep, I like to turn on water and just hear it lapping. And gaining this appreciation for the often expressed native sentiment that water is alive and that has consciousness. I turn now to end with words from Pat McCabe, Dene, Lakota woman, who tells us, water unites us and it ties us together in such a beautiful and graceful way. So one, yes, we are called to respect the water, but also it's a call for rejoicing. And I hope we all feel that when we look at Clear Creek and see people laughing and children playing and splashing, and when we think about what it's done for this community and what it continues to do for people downstream and ultimately those who receive the South Platte water. Thank you for your attention tonight. I appreciate it. So we have time for questions, and I have some cards, I think, if anyone wants my email address, because I'm happy to dialogue through email as well. And if there's questions I can't answer, I'll look them up and get back to you.
I do wanted to mention, you were talking about the sluice. We do actually have one on display right now.
Oh, cool.
So if you were kind of wanting to see one or weren't quite sure how it was set up, it's in our Epic Events Gallery. So if you want to take a look before you leave. So just wanted to kind of mention
Thank you, Kathleen. Yeah, what a great museum, and what a great opportunity. Questions, comments, anything, really?
I like hearing about the Ezekiel System. I mean, I've
Okay.
been to Taos and stuff,
Yeah.
but you hear a lot of,
Good night.
communist talk in Grand Junction, but there's a community ditch along the Dolores there that was a great, communal
Yeah.
effort to
Yeah.
get water to the farmers, it was majorly successful, I understand.
I think that's a really insightful analysis that as Westerners, we bristle when we think that, something is communitarian or communist, right? But the reality is, the West was built on community enterprise. There's no other way. And even today, like Smith Valley, Nevada, where my parents moved, when my parents divorced, and it's a lot of alfalfa farmers and dairy people. And the community is unbelievably supportive of one another. And someone has a machine malfunction, the next person brings over the thresher or whatever it is. And it's something that I think requires us to parse out a little bit intellectually, like who are we, what is our identity, and anyway, yeah, sorry.
To kind of incorporate a little more Coors in here, I have some questions around this, because we have a story around town that Coors showed up in 1872, opened his brewery in 73, and he saw the clear creek rushing down the valley, and he thought that's gonna make a great beer. But I'm looking at the date ranges from the articles of the people who are talking about how muddy and horrible it was. And I know that it didn't take him long to start putting holes in the ground and pulling his water out of an aquifer, out of the wells. Do you have any information about how people were cleaning their water? What were they actually doing to make that water drinkable? Or what the heck was Coors really thinking when he started that brewery?
Yeah, that's really insightful. And the other piece of the founding of Coors that I think is interesting, and as far as I know it's true, the buildings and structures that the original Coors occupied for his brewery was a tannery before it was a brewery. And what an unlikely structure and building to think, oh my God, it's a perfect brewery site. But you're spot on. I mean, you know as much as I do that they immediately went to the groundwater. And we have to ask why, and I think the answer is they saw Clear Creek. And there were probably seasons and moments when Clear Creek really was still running kind of clean. But the reality is that the Coors enterprise doesn't exist without hitting that groundwater. And today, they have rights, appropriative rights to the surface water, of course, and the groundwater. But the surface water is used primarily for the function of the machinery and equipment and cooling mechanisms. I think the national and international community likes to imagine when you crack a Coors that you're drinking Clear Creek water. And in a way, I mean, it is in the Clear Creek watershed and in the groundwater. But yeah, you know as much as I do. That's exactly right. They went to the groundwater.
Do you happen to know about the dates?
I thought, and I could be wrong about this, but I do have an article I can send you. I'll give you my email address. A couple of, I think they're economists or ecological economists did an analysis of Coors, and I thought they said almost immediately they went into the groundwater. But I'm happy to send you what I have.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
As far as I know, the city of Golden gets its municipal water supply out of Clear Creek. And do you know anything about how senior the water rights are for the city?
The short answer is I don't know exactly when the senior right is established, but it is a big, a senior right that they're able to flex. Obviously when you hike up the Clear Creek Trail, you see the holding pond there, and it very clearly says drinking water, So I'm not sure exactly what year, but I'm guessing it was very early because they were vying to be, yeah, sure.
I think it was in the 1860s
Okay.
is some of our most senior rights, but we have many different rights. Some of them are senior, and then we have junior rights as well.
Okay.
but
That
I
makes
don't have
sense, yeah, that
exact
totally makes
dates.
sense.
Because when we've had some drought years, we've been able to get water where they haven't been able to get water out in, say, Wheat Ridge or North Glen.
Yeah, and it makes sense, because, I mean, Golden City was competing to become the capital of Colorado and was actually doing really well and kind of on pace to do so, and then some bad luck and railroad development out of Denver and some big money financiers changed the fortune, but, those senior water rights are precious. I tell students today, and friends, you know, like, oil is nothing compared to water, and we're going to learn that sooner or later. I mean, and we already are, I shouldn't be so, kind of vain. Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, I'm curious, like with what's happening with the Colorado River and water rights and things like that, and given that like first in time is first in right, how do you see, or like, how can you speculate on like from climate change and water rights and like all this, like, do you see something like the US Supreme Court sticking to precedent, like first time is first in right, or do you see some of this changing?
It's, that's a great question, and Alex, are you reading Water Knife over the break?
Oh, I am.
Sue, sorry.
It's very good.
Anyone else read? Yeah, Water Knife. It's written by a guy who lives on the West Slope. He wrote a book called Wind Up Girl, I think, that made him kind of famous. But he imagines a future in which chaos ensues and water rights become precious, and Las Vegas becomes this major entity trying to control water, and they hire these guys called water knives, who are like detectives, and they go to try to find the most senior appropriate of rights, and it turns out that it exists with native communities, which is true. When in Colorado, the Utes were able to establish their water right in the 1980s, and that played out through a settlement case all the way into the 2000s that led to the creation of Lake Nighthorse and appropriative rights that the Utes hold. Anyway, I don't see prior appropriation going away. In fact, I think that's really unlikely. The compact that established the balance between the states, the basin states that are using Colorado, was set in 22, and they had been measuring the flow of the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry, right on the border of Arizona and Nevada, I think. Is it Arizona, Nevada? Yeah, Arizona, Nevada. And they measured in really wet years to set the original number for acre feet. And so they said, the upper basin states are going to get 17.5, I think, and the lower will get 17.5. I might be wrong with those numbers right now. 17.5 million acre feet of water. Well, the problem is there's not that much water. And right now, as you said, with drought, we're talking curtailment and contingency planning. Like I think Lake Powell is at its lowest level in its existence. And that's startling. Over 40 million people are dependent on the Colorado River in one way or another, whether that's electric power, hydroelectric power, or direct municipal use water, or Imperial Valley, which was a big winner in the compact. That's the other part I would say. It's really complicated because it's between states, and the federal government wants to play referee, but let the states work it out. And that's what happened in 22. The states all got together, and guess what? California had the most power in Congress at that time, the best lawyers, and they were able to basically, carve out the lion's share of the Colorado River, which upsets Coloradans, rightfully so. But Colorado got the second most rights, and I think that's significant. There were some real heroes for Colorado in that fight. Yeah, what else? Yeah, Kathleen?
I'm just kind of curious about the recreation rights you were talking about. Are those affected by drought periods? Are they do they have to give less water for recreation during drought times?
Well, I think because of Golden Senior water rights, they're probably pretty safe unless there is significant drought, in which case everyone's gonna share the burden. But they, as a senior appropriator, will be able to put a call on the water and take their share before it goes to people downstream. And it really pays to be upstream and be a city that was established earlier. So, yeah, I mean, if this drought continues, which it likely will, I mean, I think the people who study tree ring data are telling us that these droughts have come and gone in like 100 years. You know, you look at what happened to the people of Mesa Verde and the ancestral Pueblo. Why did they relocate from places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon and reorganize themselves on the Rio Grande? Well, it's probably because cycles of drought and over salting of the water. Yeah.
So kind of on that topic then, do the water rights get passed, or I should say, if someone like buys out like a kayaking shop or whatever, like do the rights like start over again, or do they just keep the rights from before?
Water rights can be sold. They don't, they're not associated with a particular land, and so, yes, and what's happening in Colorado more and more is that older agricultural families that have water rights are selling the water rights, and often they're selling to municipalities. You've probably read in the last week or so about Highlands Ranch going down to the Rio Grande and asking some of those Ezekiel communities, hey, how much would it take for you to sell your water? And the Ezekiel community is like, we ain't selling any water. You know, and Highlands Ranch is like, well, we'll see about that. And so the rights can be sold, but you know, more and more, it's really a very expensive proposition, and especially if you're talking about those senior rights, they're not going to change hands unless something really dramatic and significant happens. Sure.
Golden is still buying water rights. We're still buying senior water rights. There was something before city council within the last month about
really?
another
Interesting.
acquisition.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's a smart thing to do. For the Colorado Constitution provides that water belongs to the public, which is a really interesting thing to say. And I think they meant it when they framed that Constitution, but they also said that it had to be used for beneficial purposes. And that's the other part of prior appropriation we didn't really get into, is you can appropriate, but the courts are going to weigh how you're using that water. And so the case with the Golden Whitewater Park, the question is this a beneficial use of the water? And of course, Golden said, it is. I mean, this is going to fuel our economy. It's good for shops up and down Washington, and it's beneficial. But in theory, in principle, you have this idea that water belongs to people and that it is best regulated by the markets. And that means if people have deep enough pockets, so if you get multinational corporations who get hungry to buy water, which is happening, they might be able to throw down and buy some senior water rights. And
Do large residential developers have to prove that they have enough water available for what they're?
I don't think so. I mean, and this is, here I'm totally speculating, so please take it from what it's.
The answer is no.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that not insane or?
It is, and that's what I think is happening in parts of Douglas County with Highlands Ranch. I don't know if it's totally true, but I think some people had disclosures in their mortgage paperwork saying water is not guaranteed past a certain year.
Oh my God.
Don't quote me on that, but I think that's true. I think that's true. But this speaks to that kind of idea, and it hasn't failed us too bad yet that we'll engineer our way out of it. I mean, when you think about the hydraulic society we have created, it's remarkable. We were just talking about in class the Gunnison Tunnel, taking water from the Gunnison River in the Black Canyon, that just incredibly beautiful, precipitous, steep canyon, tunneling under the Vernal Mesa Mountains, 6 miles, delivering water from the Gunnison River to the Ucapagre River, and then giving that water to Montrose and Delta, who then in turn farm and create all these rich orchards and grow apples and sweet corn and of course sugar beets, which they filled, what were they called? Prairie high-rises or something, the silos that were full of refined sugar, and then they're selling that sugar to Coca-Cola and other buyers. And but that, you know, that project, it didn't happen without the federal government. This was 1906? We were just talking about this. I think it was 1906, but the federal government said it's gonna be $2.5 million, and the project came in at $7 million. But they did it. So it is a precarious infrastructure, and the last thing I'll say here is, you know, they were writing just a couple weeks ago about what would have happened in 1983, high water year. What would have happened if the dams on the Colorado, the main stem, burst? And it was close, right? There was a chance that we were gonna lose, what is the name of the dam escaping me? No, the one that makes Lake Tahoe. Glen Canyon. There was a chance it was gonna go. And if Glen Canyon goes, forget Hoover, forget Parker, I mean, all the dams along the main stem are probably, and they wrote some brilliant essays, you know, about, well, putting on my futurist best guess risk assessment hat, here's what could likely happen. And it's not good. So it is a precarious thing we're all involved in, we're all dependent on water, but I appreciate your time tonight, and I have cards over here, if anyone wants one, let me give you one. I'm happy to try to answer questions that I didn't answer. I'm always happy to research things, because I wanna learn along with you. And I'm so grateful to be part of this community. Golden, what a community. We're so fortunate, and Clear Creek is at the heart of it. So thank you for celebrating the creek here tonight with me.
Well, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming and joining us tonight, and this was recorded, so it will be going up on our YouTube channel, so if you want to watch more, see it again, or if you have someone who missed it and wanted to learn about this, it will be on our YouTube channel, so thank you.
Drive safe, everybody.